Oh, yeah, and I don't care if you liked it or didn't like it. Well, I would prefer that you like it, but what I'm curious is what were you thinking while we were doing it?
At first it didn't make sense, but then when you saw what was happening, there was more point to it.
Hmm.
Yeah. I take it you do this with very young children too?
Yeah, although invasive species is usually middle school and up.
Okay.
It's a tougher concept with younger kids. You have to be a little more careful about more complex. Well, and it's kind of a loaded topic on several levels, but yeah. Other thoughts? Yeah.
As a zebra mussel, I was happy to be spreading.
So you're like, yay, I'm taking over. She said as a zebra mussel, she was happy to be spreading.
I guess I was expecting it to spread further, faster. A lot of times, the people that were the zebras were on the same square.
Oh, yeah. And that's.
People are too afraid to be on those squares.
Well, and also there's a little bit of an adult bias in the game. If I played this with a group of younger folks, not calling you old, I'm just saying kid versus adult, you guys wouldn't be spotting the stuff. You'd be just jumping in more than you guys were a little bit more polite and friendly about it. So
I never got competitive and jumped over people's squares.
I'm not saying everybody.
You were a good zebra muscle. You didn't care about anybody.
They were all invasive.
All right, so what I'm wondering is, okay, we'll come back from that. That I just meant as a way to get us going on the topic. Did some of you have time this week to find a media piece, either watch a thing on invasives or read an article or something online? I'm not trying to out folks that didn't. I'm just wondering if we should spend some time discussing it, or if it's like 2 people did it, and then we'll jump forward.
You go to Lake Erie or you go to Lake Calhoun, and there are people with tables, and they're educating people as they walk by. That's the thing that I noticed.
Okay.
Also notice the seaweed on the water surface when they're harvesting.
Oh yeah, and that might not always be. That's just aquatic vegetation, and there's a lot of native vegetation that is harvested in lakes as well. As you guys have been learning about phosphorus and nitrogen and all that lovely stuff that makes our lakes grow so well, you'll get a lot of harvesting because of just incredible growth, regardless of what.
That's what those blue boats do?
They look like a combine. I mean, you don't get to see all of it. If you ever get to see one out of the water, they're pretty crazy. They're huge. But yeah, they're weed harvesters is a shorthand for it.
You had a quote from one of the DNR enforcement officers saying that all the lakes aren't infested yet, so it's still worth doing the effort.
Yep. That was our press release last week. It's 178 lakes and rivers have zebra mussels in Minnesota, and we've got about 11,800 lakes. So it's actually pretty small. It's less than. I'm going off my memory from a meeting last week, but it's about 178. It's 170 something are the lakes or rivers that are infested with zebra mussels. So that's less than 0.5% of our lakes. Matter of fact, it's less than 1% of all the invasives that we know of. You know, sometimes they're in water bodies before we know, but less than 1% of all our water bodies have any aquatic invasive species in them. And that's not the perception that you get because it's such a kind of crisis management. Well, it's not always crisis management, but I think the public perception is that we're trying to get everything out and we want to keep it out, and everything's getting worse, and it's uphill losing battle, which actually in the last couple years that I've switched my focus from water education to invasives is definitely not the case. There's some elements of truth to that, but less than 1% of our waters. I mean, you cannot say that about water quality at all. You know, it's not to dismiss the importance of aquatic invasives, but like you said, Sean, it's really important to keep in mind that it's not that apathy argument that I hear all the time. Like, they're all coming, there's so many species, we're not going to be able to make a dent in them. It's just not true. Yep, some will get through, of course. That's the world changes, we move stuff around, and there are things that are already here. And it is true that most aquatic invasive species, if they become established, are very hard, if not impossible, to eradicate. You can manage a lot of them. So it is definitely, and you'll see that when I get into some of the management tactics, a lot of it is focused on the prevention. Because if you can prevent stuff from getting in, you have a much better chance of keeping your system healthy. So at any rate, I'm just curious, any other observations? I won't ask if anyone did the KWL. Peggy, have you made them do other KWLs? No. Oh, so I was the first one at the last week of class. So not fair. Yes?
I didn't go out and look for new ones, but
Yeah.
I do recall recently you had a picture of a boat and someone looking at the boat were invasives. And what I remember reading about it, and I was surprised, is that people are actually getting fined.
Mm-hmm. Oh, yeah.
That's the piece I think that I was missing in my education, and maybe you could bring me up to speed on it.
Sure, I will, and I will get into that. So if I don't cover it enough, Grace, when we get there, please help me remember.
Well, no, I mean, that was the piece that I picked up from the article, and
Oh.
it was in the Star and
That was new to you.
and that was new to me.
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of aquatic invasive species law in Minnesota, and a couple years ago, all the fines were doubled. And that was not a DNR pushed thing. That was straight from citizens, a lot of lake associations, a lot of citizens that were saying, no, we need to take this seriously. People need to know about it. And if it starts hurting a few times, instead of $50, it's $100, or instead of $200, it's $500. People might start paying attention. So I'll go over that. I've got some
What
info.
about, incoming ships to, like, the Duluth Harbor or
Mhm.
something? I assume the fine rate would be different than for,
That's a different jurisdictional thing altogether, and we won't get too much into. Actually, I'm not going to get into regulation of ballast because it's out of the hands of DNR. That's a PCA one, not to pull jurisdiction, but as you've been learning with water, it's incredibly. Did you do policy last time? Yeah, I think water policy and invasives policy are both unbelievably complex and very divided by many different players. So.
There's no collaboration anymore?
Well, there is, but that would be a better conversation for us to have one-on-one about a little bit about it and what I know about it and what I don't know too. So, but I want to jump in because I keep saying that. I guess it's been a half hour of jumping in. Well, I just switched things up a little bit. And this is my plan for tonight. We're going to do a little Invasives 101. We're going to do a little bit on planning and management in the state and talk about some options for citizen involvement and some of the basics on invasive species law and best practices, because as I see it as water stewards, one of your core, the core part of what you're doing is getting the word out, educating, working with your neighbors and your communities, and the more you know about the basics about aquatic invasives, the better you're going to be able to share that with others. You know what? That's okay. You don't need to see my goals. And I already kind of got to this. Like, why do we talk about this? Well, I actually have the full number here, 11,842 lakes in Minnesota, and that's 10 acres or bigger, and 69,000 miles of natural rivers. If you include all the ditched rivers, it's like 92,000 miles.
Can you say those again? Because I have a friend in New Hampshire who says 10,000 lakes.
Oh, sure. It's also on the DNR website. I can send a link to, but this is 842. And that's lakes that are 10 acres or larger. Wisconsin actually has more than us, but they measure smaller lakes. That's not fair. If you're looking at the lakes region in both states, we're much more closely aligned than I'm just being
Do you know how
snappy.
many miles of shoreline? Because I've heard that Minnesota has more shoreline.
Yeah, I can't rattle that one off. I'd have to look again. But yeah, we have.
Is that right?
Well,
Like the east and west coast combined, we still have more shoreline?
I believe so. I believe so, but I can't rattle off. Do you know the exact number? But yeah. But if you're talking about almost 12,000 lakes, not mentioning all our wetlands and ponds, and 92,000 miles of rivers and ditches, it's not too shocking compared to one coast. It's a lot. But at any rate, so the main training that I'm doing at DNR, just to give you a little context of where I'm coming from, I was hired and I've spent a lot of time as a water educator around the state, focused on working with K-12 educators, not the kids so much, although that's where I originally started, but working with adults to help them teach about water resources with K-14 students really. And so a lot of time, so I'm taking all of that knowledge and my skill set and trying to apply it to stereotypical government permittee mandatory training on invasive species. So the new program that I am taking over is permitting and training, or I should say training mandatory permitted businesses that have to come to me or to the DNR and get invasive species training in order to get a permit to install docks, lifts, watercraft, to transport any water-related equipment that goes in and out of the water. And so, so I'm working really hard to cultivate an understanding of why the invasive species issue is such a big deal, and why businesses, especially this group, they're legally called service providers or lake service provider businesses. All those folks that are installing, removing, renting, or decontaminating water-related equipment for hire. It's not if you install your own dock on your own and nobody pays you to do it, that doesn't count. It's a business that does that. And so I try with a lot of the groups I work with to get folks to understand why Minnesota as a state and as an entity is taking this so seriously, and it's because there was such citizen pressure to do so. A lot of the invasive species laws, the newer ones, went through in 2011 and 2012, which very divided political seasons in Minnesota, and both parties came together very strongly on invasives. They wouldn't have done that if constituents didn't push for it. So that's just something I'd like to give a little context. The state as an entity is, our goal is to slow and prevent the spread of invasive species. And I keep throwing around invasive species, and somebody said common carp earlier, which made me think, I'm being a little loose with the term, but what I mean when I say invasive species tonight is a legally invasive species. So, and I'll get into, actually, I can get into categories right now. But in a broad sense, what that means is it's a species that's not from the ecosystem that you're considering. So it's from another part of the state or the region or the country or the world, but it's not native to the ecosystem you're looking at. And it does or is highly likely to cause economic harm, environmental harm, or human health, or harm to human health. So that's the legal requirement to become an invasive species. Now, there are different categories that we put on them, and I'll get into that in just a second. But I also want to mention this too, that you're talking a lot in this course about water quality, and traditionally invasive species, aquatic invasive species, are not tied closely with the concept of water quality, because because when you talk about water quality within the natural resource realm within this world, people are talking about managing nutrients, phosphorus, nitrate, all the things you've been spending most of your time talking about, stormwater runoff and volume and impervious surface and all that stuff. This is a different level of water quality. This is, when I talk about invasive species and water quality, it's generally a more holistic view that almost like a more of a layperson, if I said the quality of your lake, that makes perfect sense to people. But I just want you to have that concept in mind as an ambassador for this program as you're talking to people. If you're talking to somebody, a research scientist or somebody like a hydrologist, if you say water quality, it's going to mean something very different, and they won't associate it so much with invasive species. So that's just something, it's kind of a little insider jargony thing that I want you to be aware of. But definitely, once you get an established invasive species into a water body, it has the potential to really degrade the quality of that water body and disrupt the whole system. And it varies depending on species and all sorts of variables. What time are we at? 1:45. Should I do? I think I'll do this. I have about a 5-minute video clip. It's a nice intro to the concept. We've gone over some of the basics, but it's good to have some real video of some real species and it'll touch on those. So I'll show you this, and then we'll do another. I think we'll do a couple more slides, and then we'll break it up with some more discussion, so you're not just sitting and listening quite so much. What I don't know is the volume on this system. I did not test that ahead of time because we had all the other tech problems. Hold on one second. Sorry. Where's my mouse? Oh. How do I get it back on my screen? I get to look at my kids instead of this. Oh, come on. There it is. Oh, magic. Okay. Hold on, I'm going to make sure my volume's up all the way first, too. Okay. Oh, I bet I have to. Hallelujah. What is that? Thank you.
And Eurasian water milfoil grows in the mats on the water surface that interfere with swimming and boating and diminish the visual appeal of our lakes. These seemingly unrelated species share a common and disturbing trait. In our ecosystem, they lack disease and predator controls, so these non-native species reproduce and spread at an amazing pace. The consequence is that they compete with native species for food and habitat. This can dramatically affect commercial, tourism, and recreational uses of Minnesota's well-known lakes and rivers. Foremost among the invertebrate invaders are zebra mussels, small striped mollusks about the size of your thumbnail that multiply at incredible rates. The zebra mussels encrust rocks, docks, boats, and water supply intakes with a sharp coating of shells. Meanwhile, their larger but lesser-known relatives, quagga mussels, colonize deeper water. Like relentless underwater vacuum cleaners, zebra and quagga mussels voraciously filter algae and plankton from the water, taking food away from native clams and upsetting the natural balance in lakes and rivers. While this filtering may make the water clearer, it also reduces the food supply that sustains plants and fish. So, how are zebra and quagga mussels spread to new locations? These and other aquatic invasive species hitchhike in several ways: by attaching to things that have been in the water, by clinging to aquatic plants, and by being carried with the water itself. Once introduced to a lake or river, zebra mussels appear on docks, boat lifts, shallow rocks, and aquatic plants. Within a few years, an entire watershed can be infested. Sharp shells are attached to rocks and wash up on beaches, discouraging swimming. A loss of tourism dollars can follow. Less widespread, but grabbing lots of headlines, are carp from Asia, specifically the bighead and silver carp species, which pose a significant threat to Minnesota waters. Bighead and silver carp are voracious plankton eaters that strain the water of nutrients and outcompete native fish species for food. Originally stocked in aquaculture ponds in the south to control algae, floods allowed them to escape into the Mississippi River drainage and move upstream. They are prolific breeders, capable of virtually taking over entire stretches of river. altering the local fish community dramatically. While bighead carp eat more and grow larger, it's the high-flying silver carp that offer vivid evidence of the invasion. Approaching boats can scare entire schools of silver carp into leaping out of the water, causing serious injuries when they hit boaters and personal watercraft users. Eurasian water milfoil is one of the plant invaders which has become a nuisance in many Minnesota waters. The introduction of Eurasian milfoil to America can be traced to the aquarium trade, where plants were imported for use in fish tanks, but ended up in local waters. Eurasian milfoil is an aggressive rooted plant that quickly grows to the surface. It spreads out across the water surface, forming an umbrella-like canopy that blocks sunlight and chokes out the native plants below. Milfoil forms dense, unsightly cover through which it's difficult to swim or navigate. Small pieces of milfoil carried on boats and recreational gear can seed a new invasion if they are carried to other lakes.
If you're interested in seeing, there's a whole, this is half of the short version of this video, and then there's actually an almost close to a 30-minute version that's called Minnesota Waters at Risk. It's on YouTube if you're interested in it. But I wanted to just use a shorter clip to get you introduced to some of the species and to use the power of video to see some in action. I brought you some samples, the things that look like coasters, so you can see. These two tables here have one native and one invasive plant that are often confused with each other, just these two. So I encourage you when we take a break or later in the evening to take a peek. I tried to put a plant, either a Eurasian water milfoil or curlyleaf pondweed and zebra mussel at most tables so you could see one of each, but definitely tour around and look later. I do want to say a few other logistical pieces, some backdrop about invasive species before I jump in and have you learn a little bit more about some specific species and start being able to ask some more questions and answer some questions. A lot of this is in how we manage them and who's in charge, or I shouldn't even say who's in charge, who is tasked, who is legally required to manage invasives. And in Minnesota, the DNR and the Department of Ag are the primary two organizations or government entities that are tasked with managing invasive species. The DNR deals with primarily aquatic invasive species, some terrestrial like emerald ash borer, and we have a number of terrestrial folks in our forestry division and in my division as well. But primarily, the way the statute's written, we are the aquatics. And Department of Agriculture manages most of the terrestrial invasive species. That's the way it ended up from our statute. There is a Minnesota Invasive Species Advisory Council that's made up of probably about 20 entities, and they're very active. They have a conference every year. They do a regional gathering of experts and citizens and all sorts of folks to discuss and learn and progress on invasive species topics. And then I put that local governments and nonprofits as a catch-all because there are so many organizations involved with invasive species. So many watershed districts, soil water conservation districts, lake associations, river groups. There are just a ton of citizen organizations, county and city government that, especially in the last few years, have been doing a lot more. So it's a real partnership. There also are tribal, tribes are heavily involved, tribal governments, and I'd say the two other, from a outreach and from a learning and teaching standpoint for you all, the two I would have you pay attention to are Minnesota Sea Grant and the U of M Extension Service. I mean, they're both through the University of Minnesota, but they're very active in invasive species outreach, and they have a lot of really good resources. So if you do a project ever on invasives, that's a good place to look for resources as well. Yeah?
Can I clarify real quick?
Sure.
I think of other species that are also carried by water. They aren't necessarily, like in the video, it's saying that it's species that live in the water, but I always think of them as living in the water or along the water. Like in the West, how there's like tamarisk and things.
There are some species that, especially in the plant world, that are harder to categorize. In Minnesota, a good example is purple loosestrife. This really beautiful, beautiful purple flowering plant that will take over a wetland like that. And that one was brought intentionally for gardening. But that one can grow out of water quite a ways. And so that one is actually, we're the ones that primarily manage it, but it's kind of a weird hybrid as far as how we regulate it. It's also on the noxious weed list through Department of Agriculture. But in Minnesota, and it depends on each state that regulates, has their specific list. But yeah, well, yeah, but primarily in Minnesota, the way, and I think, well, I'll stick to Minnesota because that's what I'm working on. But the plants that are growing in or on the water or on the edge, right on the edge. That's, yeah. I'm sorry, what?
Not right very.
Not as much, but there are some that are. So that's where it's messier. Yeah, that's where it's messier. And some of that depends on the ordinary high water line, which I mean, starting to get into the legality of how we measure our waters and where the water ends, and that's a whole nother conversation. Where I'd have to bring in some people because I know there's a lot more than the little I know after working at DNR 14 years. But I wanted you to have at least a broad lay of the land and know some of the agencies involved. I mentioned before we have legal classification, and I don't want to bore you with this, but I do want you to have the basic concept and understanding the laws we have in Minnesota. This part is crucial to understanding the distinction. We have 4 different categories and for any species, and so prohibited is like, if you think of a stoplight, that's the red category in my mind. Prohibited species are species like zebra mussels and quagga mussels that you cannot possess, you can't move them, you can't do anything with them. You're not allowed to have them, with some very specific exceptions. Regulated invasive species are the next. Actually, I could go into, I should have slides. So here's prohibited species. So zebra and quagga, and you probably heard it, or you might have heard it mentioned quagga in the video. You don't hear that in a lot of PR, but it's a close cousin of the zebra mussel. And actually what's I find kind of geekily interesting is that the quagga is an extinct relative of the zebra in the equine world. So that's why they picked, because of the zebra striping, they've got the stripe on them, and the quagga is very similar to the zebra mussel. So quaggas and zebras are both in Lake Superior. Quagga mussels have not spread to any interior waters in Minnesota. If you go down to Lake Mead, I always forget. It's southwest. I gotta look it up. That's sad, but both are in Lake Mead. But quaggas are much more aggressive there. They're a little bit bigger. They can live in slightly deeper water, and so that's why I'm spending a couple extra moments on the quagga, because if you ever hear it, it's the prevention for it is the same as preventing zebra mussels, and you just don't hear about it in Minnesota as much, even though it is in Superior. But, Asian carp, I got to change that slide. Legally not called Asian carp anymore in Minnesota. They're called invasive carp. There are 4 species of invasive carp. They mentioned 2 of them in here, and those 4 are not the common carp. That would be a 5th one. That's a whole nother conversation. Black carp, grass carp, bighead, and silver are the 4 invasive carp. Common carp, using the lay version of the term invasive, are quite invasive, but legally they are not an invasive species. That's a whole. There's a lot of interesting logistics and politics when it comes to classifying species and how we manage them.
There is an interesting thing about the common carp, like in the Ramsey Washington watershed.
Yeah, they're very active with it.
They get fishermen out there in the winter where they have little radio collars on the carp, and they can figure out where the schools are. And then these guys put nets down underneath the ice and catch them in the middle of the winter, because it stirs up a lot of nutrients, and they're trying to get rid of the common carp. And they're actually also trying to prevent the headwaters of the baby carps up in the headwaters of the Phelan Lake chain.
Yeah, there's some really interesting common carp research. You may have heard of Peter Sorensen, who's the head of the Invasive Species Center at the University of Minnesota, is a researcher. He's actually done more work on common carp than he has on invasive, and that's kind of how he first made his mark. He's done a lot with both. He's fantastic. But anyway, so here are some of the common, or I don't even want to say common, but the prohibited invasive species in Minnesota we talk about. Now these, you cannot possess them unless they're like this, where they're fully sealed and can't be released. If they're dead, that's fine. But you can't, and this is the stem or the guts of a lot of the invasive species law. So if you're transporting a boat or a trailer that's got zebra mussels on it or in it, you're breaking the law. Whether it's intentional or not doesn't matter. You're not allowed to have these in your possession unless you can always, and I'll say it again later, but you can always bag up a sample and bring it to a DNR office legally. That's always okay. And there are some exemptions with these where you can get a one-way pass at the end of a season. Let's say you're taking a boat out of Minnetonka and it's totally covered with zebra mussels. Well, it's unrealistic to expect a bunch of people trying to scrape down their boats for hours if they have a large boat at an access. So there are one-way passes you can use to get your equipment back to clean it up, but it has to be cleaned before it hits the public road on the way back next season. And I'll get more into the law stuff for those of you that are interested. But so then the next group, the yellow light ones, are regulated. Someone mentioned spiny water fleas when we were out there. That's kind of an interesting one. Rusty crayfish, the big snail at the bottom with the penny. Those are mystery snails. That's their name. It's not that we don't know what they are. They're Chinese mystery snails and banded mystery snails, and they're aquarium snails. So a good example, these regulated species, you can own these legally. There's nothing wrong with going to the pet store and buying mystery snails and having them in your aquarium. You just can't let them be free. In a free living state is the legal term, which also includes sticking a hook through the head of a crayfish and casting it out, because it could escape and live.
But
So
I can still flush it, right?
yeah. Let's not flush anything. Yeah. Oh yeah, yeah. Although to be honest, I don't know how many things would survive the process. I've been to some wastewater treatment plants, and it's pretty amazing, actually. I don't know that for sure, but at any rate, so the regulated tier, you're still not supposed to transport them or let them go, but these are things that you can possess. And some of them, like the spiny water flea is that tiny little thing on the bottom there that's like 3/8 of an inch full grown. You wouldn't want to possess them. There are just certain species that are put into this category because they're difficult to regulate. So they're serious, we take them serious, but it's very hard to put certain things in the prohibited class and then be able to regulate and enforce it effectively. So that's one thing I've learned in the last couple of years I've been focused on invasives, that when you look at our infested waters list, it doesn't include all the invasive species in Minnesota. I like learning stuff, I like figuring out why things work. And it is a crazy puzzle. I've been starting to piece it together, and there's a lot of good rationale for most of it, but it's not neat and tidy at all. And I'm still learning a lot. So that's one thing. If you're in the invasives world and you want to understand, you can ignore a lot of the details if it doesn't, the minutia of it. But if you're going to try and understand it and educate about it, that's something. Give me a call. I'll tell you what I'm learning. And the other two categories. Quick, go back here. This is a much prettier picture of some spiny water flea. These are little globby things with the spikes. That's a very technical term. There's unregulated and unlisted. And so unregulated, and I don't expect you to memorize all this, but an unregulated species would be something like a pheasant, like a ring-necked pheasant. There are certain species in Minnesota that are non-native, but we manage them. No, earthworms are. They are. Actually, you know what? I gotta look them up. No, but they're invasive, but I can't remember which category they're in. They're all earthworms in Minnesota are invasive species. Yeah, but I don't know which of the. They're not prohibited.
Because I have them in my yard, and I don't think
Yeah.
I'm breaking the law.
No, right. See, this is right. Yeah, exactly. And I don't think they're even regulated. They might be unlisted completely. I don't know. That's a good one. And we were just talking about that. I was at Downer. We were watching a PBS Kids show all about earthworms. My kids were like, oh, and they were helping save the worms and doing all this great worm stuff. And I'm like, they are invasive species to my husband. And he's like, yeah, I know. Well, they don't quite, yeah. It was a lot easier to teach people about water. My oldest kid got that. He doesn't quite get this invasive thing yet.
What about minnows? Like using them for bait, they're usually not native.
Well, okay, so yeah, but it depends on how they're sourced. So yeah, that's one of the concerns with invasive carp is that if you have somebody that can't ID the difference or doesn't care, you could have people using small invasive carp and them spreading much faster further that way. That's definitely a concern.
Well,
That's how rusty crayfish were spread.
Yeah, by bait.
technically
Yeah.
our smelt were invasive. too,
Yes.
right?
Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. There are plenty of. Well, they were non-native. I don't know if we ever legally classified them as smelt. But okay, so there are certain species that, like ringneck pheasant, they don't take over the whole system. We happen to like to hunt and eat them as a society or parts of our society, and we manage them. So it's a little, I shouldn't call it capricious, but that we definitely categorize based on human value.
I'm trying to get
Yeah.
my little brain around.
Yeah.
Okay, gardening. I relate to gardening.
Yeah.
Tansy
Mhm.
is prohibited.
Mhm.
Therefore, it should not be in someone's garden.
Right.
It's illegal for it to be.
If it's, well, and I have to look at tansy if that's prohibited, because we don't, that's where my knowledge is pretty weak, because on the terrestrial side I haven't,
I'm on
the Department of,
dot site
yeah.
that they just made a really cool PDF, you guys. So look it up. It just released in March. But they listed as, I didn't go over to the DNR site, but this one I have downloaded. So anyway, I think it is prohibited. But that is, so I know so many gardeners that have it.
Oh yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, no, and that's what, it's very hard to manage. Some of these species, like curly leaf pondweed, is a common. That's yeah, the flat one. No, that's the look-alike. Here, yeah. So it's kind of a flat, crinkle-leafed plant. We have native pondweeds in Minnesota that look somewhat like it too, but the curly leaf one has been in Minnesota for about 100 years. And it's been so prevalent in the lakes that have it. People are used to it for generations. So if you're used to it, it's not even in your concept. You don't have a mental image of it. It's a natural thing. My grandma or my grandpa or my great grandma might remember it if you're on that lake. So there are some species. So because of its widespread in here for so long, that's one of the reasons we don't designate waters for curly leaf. We track them, we know where they are, but that doesn't trigger a listing. And there are certain species, if you look at state statute, that are exempt from, that are invasive, and they're prohibited. You can't have them, you can't move them around, but they would be so hard to actually enforce it and have it mean anything. And this is my interpretation of learning this, that they don't trigger something on the prohibited species list. So it starts getting messy, yeah.
How long does something have to be here before it's considered native?
Yeah, talk to your legislator about that. The DNR doesn't have like some set.
There is no rule.
No, I don't.
Because white-tailed deer are not native.
Oh, there's plenty of things that aren't. I mean, and it depends until when. If you're going to do a restoration, are you restoring to like pre-settlement? What are you restoring to? And so I mean, it's more of a philosophical debate than anything. It's fascinating.
Have you read 1491 and 1493? Those are, they cover that exact.
Yeah, and it's a fascinating concept. I mean, I remember talking about it in classes when I was an undergrad and a grad student. But there isn't like a magical, easy, across the board. I will tell you that for managing different pieces of land, I know that agencies will set, like, say, when we say restoration, it means to this era or to this ecosystem. So it's not completely, up in the air. They've picked and it's stated, and there's strategic plans and all that to support it, but you have to pick at some point. So, all right. And then there are also unlisted native species, and it's basically everything else that's not native. And those you still aren't allowed to release any non-native species in a free living state, because you never know when something could become a problem. Yeah. Fortunately, Minnesota winters tend to not let most things. I haven't been able to really get a strong to validate this, but there's for a while in the invasives world, there's kind of a rule of tenths, or 10%, 1% rule, that of 100 species spread around the world, about 10% approximately could survive in a new environment, and about 10% of those, or 1% of the whole, could actually become invasive. But it's a very crude estimate, and I haven't been able to find good research to back it, but that's a common thing I've heard in my time in the invasives world. So even though we spread stuff all the time, and it spreads around the world on its own and really well with our help, it's still the vast minority of things that can become invasive. Okay, let's sit past this. Oh, let's do something more than lecture. Were there questions? Were there?
I thought there were 4 categories.
Yeah, it's
Regulated, unregulated.
and unlisted, and that's kind of I call it a catch-all. Just it's to have regulation in place so that it's not a free-for-all. That's really, for the camera, that's really not a great DNR official line, but that's my interpretation to make it understandable. Okay, any questions about this mini lecture section? Anything else that's been running around your head?
So for the invasive carps,
Yeah.
By closing off Locken Dam in Minneapolis, like how safe is the rest of northern Minnesota? Like, how soon till the St. Croix gets infested? Like, how soon will these giant things be?
There's nobody that's going to be able to answer that question. That's like a magic ball question. I mean, you could talk to Peter Sorensen, and he's not going to say, well, I think in 5 years for sure. No, there's no way of knowing how fast things are. It depends. I can tell you that the closing of that Locken Dam is fantastic, because that shuts down the primary way that they can move on their own. Now, it doesn't mean that we couldn't have some people using big head carp minnows as bait without knowing, and taking them up somewhere and introducing them to a new system. That's always possible. So let's see. Yeah.
If somebody noticed something they thought might be an invasive species, what would be the best way to identify it or report it?
A couple things. First of all, I would say you got a picture of it. Take a picture if you got a phone with a GPS. That's specific to as specific as you can be with your location. That's very helpful. We get a lot of calls every year, and if somebody says, I think I saw a zebra mussel on the north side of this lake, it's kind of a needle in a haystack. So I would say take a sample if you can. You can legally, that's one exception, you can legally bag up or jar up a sample and bring it to a DNR office. I would take a picture of it, and if you can, even just saying it was, 50 feet from this public access on shore, or, we were out in our boat, and, just to try and give them a little context. Because when we have a report, then if the sample looks like it might be that species, or it is, then they'll send out staff, biologists, or will either get or hire divers to go out in some cases and verify. And if we had a couple examples in Becker County where we had a few examples. 2 sadly turned out to be zebra mussel infestations. The third, we couldn't verify it at all, which is promising, and we had really quick response and checking, because we had very good, precise information. We get a lot of people saying, I found zebra mussels, I found them, they were on this plant that was attached to the leg of this bird, which is a really common way that people say that they pass around, and it's not completely impossible for that to happen, but it's not the primary vector. It's not the primary way that zebra mussels move. And so we got photos of the last one that was sure, and they were little snails that were on the plant. I mean, there's a lot of people that are very eager, which is great. I like that people are paying attention, but when they're small snail shells and mussel shells, if you're not paying attention or you don't know, they all start looking a little scary, especially if it's your lake and you want to keep everything out. So, other questions? Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry.
Just follow-up
Yeah,
question.
yeah.
I apologize.
No, it's okay.
Is there like a number you can call? Because maybe we'll
Yeah.
go down and
Oh,
say,
I'm sorry,
yeah,
yes.
that lake already has zebra mussels in it.
Yes.
We'll throw all the
And I'll, wait, that might have segue for me. Let me see. No, I'm gonna, not quite yet. I was gonna come back to it after you dug in instead of me lecturing. But yeah, the quick answer is, there are two things. One, you can look online. Each species on the DNR site, it's a pretty nice little page, has aquatic plants and animals, and you can look and learn more information, see some photos. That's a good starting spot. And you can also look up the infested waters list. So that'll tell you for many of the species if that water body has them. And then if you don't want to do those steps, you can always call your invasive species specialist. There are
Classified by category? Because I don't think it is it? The DNR website?
What you mean by species?
No, by like prohibited, regulated, unregulated.
I would say don't worry about that. If you think it's an invasive species, we care about all of them. It's just the legality of it.
Okay.
So I wouldn't worry about that. Anyway, so there are 8 aquatic invasive species specialists for the DNR around the state, a couple per region. And there's a link I can get you that everybody's Metro, right? Right, sorry, I move around the state a lot. So yours would be Keegan Lund. He's out of the Warner Road, St. Paul Regional Office. He's a great guy. He does 130 permits in the open water season probably, and each one means he has to go out and scope out a lake and do a lot of paperwork. And so he's in the open water season, he's hard to get. He's fantastic. He is responsive, but he probably is doing 2 jobs for one. He's one of probably the busier jobs at DNR. Yeah.
A lot of the lakes have information at the boat landing.
Yes. And I'll get to that too. Yeah.
If it is an infected lake,
Yeah.
it says this
Yep.
lake is infected.
Yep. There's an orange sign, and I'll get to that. You know what? Let's what time is it? 7. Oh, 7:15. Yeah. Thanks. Apparently can't read the clock. Because I think you guys are going to answer and ask a lot of the questions that we'll get to, which is fine. We don't have to do the order of my slides. But again, sitting and listening, not my favorite. What I'm going to do is give each table I'll give each table a packet, an envelope or a folder with either 3 animal or 3 plant species. These are all invasives, and what you'll get in here is a card that has a picture and some basic information up top, and 3 blank categories. One says biology, one says means of spread, and one says the impacts. And then also in your packet are 3 little slips of paper that also say biology, 3 that say means of impact, and 3 that say impact. Did I say biology, means of spread, impact? See if you can figure out which goes to which. And you know what? I am going to, try it without any references first. Just take a crack at it and see what you think. And then I would, come get my attention, flag me down if you would like some more information about the species. I have some brochures and different info that might help you figure it out. There you go. So what did you notice about this? I gave you either 3 plants or 3 animals. Was there anything that surprised you when you were looking at your species? Anything that,
Similarities.
say a little bit more about that.
Some of the descriptions are almost interchangeable.
Very, very similar, yeah. Now, did you have animals or plants?
I guess they'd be animals.
Yeah, okay.
How did they, and some go back like to the late 19th century, how did they track around when the infestation occurred?
You know what? I've never gone back to see what they base the histories on.
Okay.
I mean, there's general consensus for most of the species. You'll see a little bit of variability, but I don't know. I'd have to go and figure that out.
Okay.
Yes.
I thought it was faucet snail, how it's not actually the snail that's all that bad, but
The parasite?
tree toads.
Tree toads. It would be great if there were little tree toads. That'd be cute. Trematodes.
And yeah, the parasite that they carry. So it's kind of interesting that
Yeah.
the snail that's designated as the invasive because it's,
Yeah, because you can't really.
you can't.
There is an invasive virus. There are some invasive viruses, but yeah, but I digress. And somebody over here had asked, related to that, what is swimmer's itch anyway? So that's something I'll do. No, different than chiggers.
They're not?
That's different. Different, unfun. Different type of not fun. Yeah, I've had swimmer's itch. It's not fun. Swimmer's itch, and actually, it's a product of the same kind of parasite path that that is the problem with the little teeny faucet snails, the parasite that goes with them. With swimmer's itch, it's a parasite that lives inside snails that are native to Minnesota and lots of places. And they, at a certain stage of their life, they come out of the snail, and the next host is a duck or some kind of waterfowl. And so they burrow into them and keep on with their life cycle. So sometimes they think our bodies are ducks. They're trying to burrow into whatever. And so you get out of the water, and if you dry off, especially slowly, if you don't towel down, if you just let it dry on you and lay in the sun, they start burrowing in as the water on you evaporates, and they panic because they're going to die. And they try to burrow in, they can't, but it causes lovely itchy red spots, just like a mosquito bite. It's our body's reaction to their attempt to hurt us. But we're not ducks, so they can't get in us. Now with the faucet snail, it's the same process, but it's a new species of parasite that our waterfowl aren't adapted to. They haven't evolved together. And so that one, it's very deadly for a lot, and there have been some big die-offs in waterfowl up at Lake Winnipegashish. 2008 maybe? Somewhere 7 or 8, there was a huge die-off. About 10,000 scaup was the type of waterfowl that died off from this parasite. And so that's one reason why actually you'll notice you won't notice necessarily, I have noticed because I have to teach about it, that faucet snails have bumped up from the regulated list to the prohibited list because it's a much higher concern. Those big mystery snails, they can disrupt the system, but they don't have that cataclysmic impact as the parasite does. So you'll see some legal changes that go in line with what kinds of impact the invasives have. Anyway,
I'm
yeah.
just curious,
Yeah.
Are you a biologist by training?
Nope. I have undergrad in natural resources and environmental studies. It's a broad-based systems, a little of all ologies, and my master's is in environmental education through the College of Forestry at the University of Minnesota. All right. Yeah. Yeah, there are native snails, but I would have to defer to our biologist. I'm not a snail expert, and they're very hard to identify, the differences between them. I wouldn't even pretend to do it. I know, like on base, I'll go off of base size. There aren't too many. I don't think there are any in Minnesota, but this you should not quote me on. I believe that there are none of the, if you ever see the huge ones, I think in Minnesota those are always the mystery snails. But there are a vast array of snails, and so that's one I'm not good at yet. Okay, so you noticed some things about this. Were there you noticed that they sounded similar. What about some of the groups that looked at plants? Did you notice similarities or differences as you looked at them?
Yeah, there was similarities to ours. We actually rotated a couple of our definitions as we went through them, and eventually got them right. But yeah, there's a lot of similarities.
Yeah, definitely. How about in origins? What did you notice when you were looking at I didn't ask you to look at, that's just the information at the top. Did you notice anything about origins or pay attention to that one?
We had 2 that were from Asia.
Oh, a lot of them from Asia, yeah. And I picked a few here now. One that I mentioned earlier, Peggy mentioned too, rusty crayfish. That's from the Ohio River Valley. So they're not all from Asia, but a lot of the ballast water ones are coming from Asia or Europe and Asia.
But there is a native crayfish, right?
Oh yeah, they're native crayfish too. Yeah. Mm-hmm. Any questions at this this information made you go, I wonder.
Is there a invasive cattail?
Yeah, and that's when that's a very interesting debate. There's a lot of discussion about that. There's narrow and broadleaf, and then there's actually a hybrid. That's the other trick with a lot of invasive plants is they hybridize with the natives, and then it's really hard to ID them. So yes, and but it's still hasn't bumped up the scale of invasive up to prohibited. Yeah.
How's the conversation going with what has come from the United States and being invasive in other places?
Oh, we ship out plenty of stuff.
Is the conversation like what we've done if it's a problem here, or that like exchanging, if you know the country of origin, so you're finding out, oh, parasitoids are great with blah blah blah, or whatever works with certain systems. So you go to where they're originally from, find out what.
Are you asking about finding biological control for them? Okay, yeah. There's some really interesting. Okay, now you're starting to get into the questions and the comments you're having are great, and it gets right into how we manage this stuff. It's messy. It's messy politically. It's messy. Environmental and social systems is very complex. So there are some options. As I mentioned earlier, the primary management tool that the state of Minnesota uses is prevention. We're trying to just stop new things from getting here and slow the spread of what's already here. And early detection, rapid response, and containment. I hear all sorts of acronyms thrown around at meetings where they're working on these, and I can't even rattle that one off yet. It's not in my vernacular yet, which is kind of nice. But EDRR or EDRs, is that early detection, rapid response. Just having plans in place for if you find something and what do you do and who do you contact, how do you verify, just the whole process with it. That's part of our management system. And then management and control of the species directly. And when I say directly, any state agency or local, any level of government, we're pretty limited in our scope, even though we're statewide as the DNR or the PC or whatever, because of money and because we do have 11,000 lakes and 69,000 miles of rivers that it's just not financially possible to be everywhere and monitor everything and protect everything, but we work with a lot of great partners, and that makes it much more possible. So management control, and that's where it gets into, you can do some physical control, you can do some pulling if it's species or removal like zebra mussels. You do chemical. A lot of our plant management from the DNR side of things is chemical control based on percentage of acreage of your lake, and lake associations will often apply for grants to get treatment, to pay for chemical treatment for Eurasian water milfoil and curly-leaf pondweed are the two primary. And then biological control, and that's a tricky one, but fascinating. If you any, and I can't, I gotta go back. I've been saying this too many times without getting the stepping stones for this one. But I remember studying Australia when I was in college because it's like the perfect case example of bad introduction after bad introduction after bad introduction, because they brought in frogs to eat a certain insect, and then whoops, the frogs eat insects at a whole different level of the grasses. And then there's frogs everywhere. So I remember watching cars drive down the road and they're just popping. It's really gross, but fascinating, and sliding all over because they're these giant frogs. So then they bring in something to eat the frogs, and it doesn't quite work because they would just say, well, it eats it at home. Let's bring it here. So biological control is a really tricky one. There's one really good example, a current example that's being used, and that's for loosestrife, for purple loosestrife. There are a few different loosestrife beetles. I can't rattle off the actual Latin names of them. I would recognize it if I was reading it, and I've seen it enough, but I can't do that yet. But so there are a suite of them that have been heavily tested, and they're from Europe, that evolved with the plant. They feed almost exclusively, actually some of them exclusively on that plant, kind of like asparagus beetles, if any of you are asparagus growers. Those little jerks. I'm an asparagus grower. So. There's a couple. The one I don't mind. The other one though. But anyway, So they disrupt it, and there's some that they bore into them and mess up the stems. There are stem cutter ones, and then there are some that bore into the bulbs underneath and mess them up that way. Again, very technical terminology. But it's fascinating that we've now in Minnesota we've seen some really successful control. It depends, and it's not and it's definitely not a silver bullet. You can't just expect if you have loosestrife that if you get the loosestrife beetles, it's going to be slam dunk, they're gone. But because there are a lot of factors involved, but in some cases it has been very highly effective in very dense areas of it. Yes.
I was just going to say I live on a natural environment lake, which had a lot of perishable loosestrife all around the shoreline, and the beetle was introduced probably late 90s, around 2000, somewhere in there. And there's still a little bit of loosestrife, but hardly any left.
Isn't that amazing to see such a really pretty rapid change?
I was listening to the radio on the way out, and they've released more emerald ash borer
Wasps. Oh yeah, those yay parasites in some ways.
There's something, and I'm not pulling it up in my brain, but it was NPR, and it was either Wisconsin or Minnesota, I think, that Lake Association,
I think I know where you're headed.
that they would not allow?
For Zequinox, that's the brand name of an experimental biological control of zebra mussels, and it just got federal approval for use. It's been used, it's been researched and tested in Minnetonka and some other places in Minnesota. It might be a really good, useful tool for specific cases, but it's not going to be a silver bullet answer either. I'm going to be a broken record. Most of invasives, there isn't. The closest you get to a silver bullet in any aquatic invasives that I've come across are the sea lamprey, where they, after decades of research, got a lampricide that's very specific and doesn't impact the rest of the system. And millions and millions of dollars every year go into treating and keep it in check. It's a very small percentage of the lamprey. One thing I should mention is, if you didn't know it, we have native lamprey in Minnesota. So if you are the type that's going to go fishing in lamprey waters, if you see one, make sure it's I have stories from our fisheries staff where they'll get a fisher, an angler or something, fisherman or a fisherwoman coming up with a bucket of them and say, "Look, I got all these lamprey," and you're like, "Yeah, they're native." That's one I like to share because a lot of people don't know that one. But anyway, oh shoot, I sidetracked myself. Dang it, I try not to do that in class. I'm terrible about it normally. What was I answering for you though? Oh, Zequinox, yeah. So in that one, it's very expensive for treatment, and it doesn't have good results in clinical trials. It doesn't have it in open water trials, in field trials. Thank you. It's so expensive that it's really will be cost prohibitive at this point to do treat a whole lake with it and get rid of it. So it's not at this stage. It's not looking like it's going to be that magical answer. Now it might be something that could be used very surgically when you first find an infestation in a water body. That's where there's some interest in how could we use this as one of our tools. And that's where a lot of the research, a lot of preventative measures, what I hear too is a lot of prevention. It does a lot of work and accomplishes a lot, but it also buys time to figure out better ways to manage and more targeted ways of managing it. Some of the research for control or carp research show us a lot more about the biology and what we can do. Okay, let's see, how am I doing on time? There is a state plan for invasive species, and it's multi-agency. All the groups I mentioned earlier when I gave you the quick lay of the land have all been involved in it, even though the two main the authority is primarily given to DNR and to Department of Ag. There is a state plan, and it's based on all of these different tools that I rattled off. The big challenge for all of this is that there are multiple pathways of spreading a lot of this stuff. Some things like zebra mussels, when they're in their veliger, that's one of my favorite invasives word, a little geeky science word. Veliger, not villager. That's the baby zebra mussels. You can't see them, they're microscopic. And so that's the primary reason there's a lot of the invasive species law has to do with draining water, because you can't see them in the water body. So the easiest thing, at first when the law came into effect, it was don't take water from any infested water body. Well, you might not know it's infested yet, or you might not care, or there's a lot of reasons when finally they said, no, it's really easy for the most people not to transport water between sites. You dump out your ballast water if you've got a boat that has ballast. You pull your drain plug and make sure the water drains. So there's all sorts of things that you can do that are relatively easy. It's some behavior change, so I do emphasize relatively easy, but there's also the other end of the regulatory thing is that we've got, along with the first free bullets here, or first set of bullets here, we've got public awareness, our watercraft inspectors, who are primarily there as educators. That's their primary role. We've got signs like this gentleman mentioned at the public access that show if it's infested and talk about clean, drain, dry messages, good practice messages. We've got decontamination stations that move around the state to do pressure washing and in both at coming into accesses and leaving them. So these are all some of the tools for managing it. But the other one we got is we have laws, regulation, we've got permits as a subset of that, and we have enforcement. Now it's not nearly enough to enforce it, but we have carrots and we have sticks.
And peer pressure?
Oh yeah, we've got plenty of, and that's become, and that's the power of the Lake Association, and it's amazing to see. It is phenomenal to see.
A question about that is
Yeah.
the effort to get the Lake Associations in the Minnehaha Creek area
Mm-hmm.
to work together on this, and I think some of them were actually going to the Capitol.
Oh, they're very active Lake Associations in this part of the state.
The key threats actually in the Minnehaha Creek watershed lakes, like which critters are you trying to keep away from these lakes in the West Metro?
That's, yeah. Yeah, and the DNR doesn't break down by, like, that's a local control issue,
Well,
other than all of them is the
working
good
in
answer.
Building on invasives, and I was
Yeah.
wondering what they try to do, like maybe Peggy knows, I don't know.
Well, they do all of those things, public
Yeah.
awareness, signage, enforcement,
Is
inspection.
it mostly
Yeah.
zebra mussels, or is also the milfoil?
Yeah.
It's both.
Funny water fleas,
And
it's-
Okay.
Yeah, and
all
Minnetonka has quite a number of invasive species in it, so there's a lot of and that's part of the reason why and the active lake associations around here is part of why Minnehaha Creek is so active in invasive species, because the citizenry around here is very active in keeping their lakes in good shape and the creek in shape.
So there's lots of lake associations in the watershed district, and then there's also the coalition of lake
Yes.
associations, which is
Arching over,
an organization of organizations.
isn't that fun?
Yeah, and so there's multiple layers of citizen groups. The coalition of lake associations does the lobbying.
And I'm sorry, I can't see your take, but you had mentioned these are the orange signs that if you're at an access and there's invasive species there, you'll see the little picture and the name. Excuse me. You can also find out by looking at the DNR website. We've got the designated infested list, and it's pretty easy to find on the DNR website, which is saying something. We have a big website. You can also find the current list in the fishing regulations book for any of you that go fishing. Granted, it's only up to date as of printing, so as the open water season continues, if there are new discoveries, those will be slightly out of date. But the website, and as you had asked over here, I'm sorry, I don't know your name in orange, but Greg, you can talk to Keegan Lund. He'll be like, they're all calling me now, April. He is fantastic. So he's just busy. You also might have seen these brown signs. We've got a variety of different informational signs about messaging. The little red stop sign is a national program, the Stop Aquatic Hitchhikers campaign. There's some really interesting research on the effectiveness and ineffectiveness of that campaign online, and but it's been a really good collaboration nationally, and we're a local partner in it, and they do some good, excellent work and have really good handouts and resources. So if you're going to do a project or reach out and want some things to hand out, it's through Wildlife Federation, kind of randomly. It's not a water-based one. Okay. So really the emphasis for this group for you all tonight is what can you guys do? What do you need to know? I'm trying to give you a lot of background information. So again, that's kind of why I've ended up being a little more lectury. But you can inspect, you can educate, you can educate on your own as you're doing with the Stewards program. You can actually sign up and volunteer as an inspector. You don't have the legal authority that a DNR inspector would have, but you would have the traditionally all of the associations that hire inspectors, they are volunteers. Now, as of last year, the DNR, the legislature changed things so that the DNR can delegate its legal authority, and it has to be done very formally. It can't be done with the lake association. It has to be done through a local unit of government to make sure that we can have good management and control of the volunteers and cover insurance and all sorts of logistical pieces. But a lot of local county and city governments will do grants and partnerships and get DNR authority to hire inspectors that can require decontaminations and some of the other pieces that come with state level authority.
Is that primarily for high usage lakes?
No, I mean, you can, any group that's interested in doing it can apply and do it, and we have some grants to support it. And we also will do, if you've got a large enough group, I think they usually say about 20 plus, we'll do volunteer trainings. Even if you don't have the legal authority, you can set up your own volunteer inspectors. So we have a volunteer/ambassador program, and then we have the actual hired and DNR trained with our authority type of inspection as well. Is that clear? Sorry, I didn't, it's a lot, yeah.
So do any of these inspections get hostile?
Oh, sometimes, yeah. I just heard one about one in a meeting this morning where the staff locked their car doors and stayed inside while a guy jumped up and down on their trailer and threw rocks at the car.
Oh my God.
That happens.
This is behavior change, and this is behavior change that is
Yeah.
voluntary. It's not optional.
Last year, when the ice out was so late, there were a few of my group of businesses that were, oh, sorry, I just smacked the microphone, that were in a really big hurry to get as many of their boats and docks and everything in the water as they could, and almost ran somebody over. I mean, sometimes that there are people that are in a hurry or like, yeah, I know this. There also have been a number of cases where, especially if it's a volunteer group, as soon as you're at an access, I should say, as soon as you're doing inspection work, the assumption is you are DNR often, even though we only have about 140 or 150 inspectors officially statewide. And if you have a group of volunteers that are passionate about keeping their lake clean, some overstep their legal boundaries. I've heard stories about that too. Some are really gung-ho and want to protect that lake and are a little more aggressive. There's different personalities involved. There's plenty, but the vast majority of interactions for DNR inspectors and volunteer inspectors that I hear about are very straightforward. Did you know about this? Can I help you with this? Here are the things that would, from a DNR perspective, that would require us to, or that would require you to get your equipment decontaminated or partially decontaminated. The vast majority are very civil, but there are some great stories. There are some interesting stories that I've heard in the last couple of years.
And I
So
can
a
add
great
to
way
that.
to meet your neighbors on the lake.
Oh, it is, yeah. Sitting at the Access for a little while, yeah. Yes.
I can add to that because I was a 2011 watercraft inspector.
Oh, yeah.
And most people are very willing to go through inspections and are very willing to learn about aquatic invasive species.
It's just, there are some cases of hostility, but it's not as often as you would think. It depends on the situation and how busy they are, how busy the access is, how frustrated they are. But most of the time, they're very willing and very friendly.
What kind of authority did you have?
I was only a level 1 inspector, so I didn't have, I couldn't find anyone.
Oh, okay.
But I think that's changed now since
Mhm.
then.
Yeah. But, you know, all of the DNR, we have level 1 and level 2, but all of the DNR inspectors, excuse me, they have the ability to call, and anyone does really, to call a conservation officer if there's an aggressive situation or somebody, matter of fact, if somebody is breaking invasive species law and ignores the inspector, I mean, you're trained, you don't get in their way, you're not like trying to stop them or anything like that. You call, you just say, you know what, there's a boat with a ton of zebra mussels or a bunch of veg hanging off it, it's headed into this lake,
Take down their
come on,
license.
yep.
Yeah.
So no, it's meant to be non-confrontational, very informational, educational, and actually it's been highly effective.
Have they still been doing, or I've heard rumor of reward, you know, like, oh, I have my, I know, invasive species, so like, I gotta go to the front of the line. Did they ever?
Not in Minnesota. There have been a number of different things.
And I didn't mean the front of the line thing, but.
No, I know what you mean. In some states, there are some very interesting examples of successful ways to manage it, but they generally happen in states that have 5 lakes. I'm being a little facetious, but not much. Where, you know, a lot of western states are more river, and they're not, you know, everybody comes to Lake Mead's a great example. Everybody just comes there and they wait in a long line. They expect it. So there are certain tags you can get around your motor that you can't. If you use your motor, it breaks. So just think of like the clothing tags on expensive clothing. Those little. It's that kind of a thing where if the seal is broken, or if the seal is not broken, then you don't have to be inspected again because clearly you haven't used your watercraft. But and Minnehaha Creek was doing. They were experimenting actually. The watershed was experimenting with a similar kind of tag thing last year. So that's probably actually what you were talking about. And they're not doing it this year. I talked with some of our watercraft inspection staff, and I don't know the details of why, but also in Minnesota we have it's all public water. You know, we're in riparian. You talked about water policy too. So this is a riparian state. We're on the border of it before you get to Western water rights. So it's public water, and public access is, you can't just decide we're going to close them, you know, and shut them down. So the other piece too is how do you manage something like a tag system on all the public accesses, on all the water bodies, and how do you staff them 24 hours a day to be consistent, you know, and to avoid people like getting up at like 4 a.m. to beat the inspectors and get it, you know, stuff like that does happen. So at any rate, no, there are fascinating ideas, and if we can find one of them that works, that would be great. Right now, we have had several different decals and stickers. Next year, you'll be hearing about another one that I get to do. There's, I didn't even put a slide on. I wasn't even thinking about talking about this, but I got you. You're captive. I will tell you. Well, because I'm trying to get the word out. It would be great if you all know about it. There's, in 2011, it was part of the suite of invasive laws that got updated and newly made, but it doesn't go into effect until next July. And what this is anyone that trailers watercraft or water-related equipment like docks, lifts, any kind of water-related equipment, if you pull it on a trailer in Minnesota, you're going to have to do an online or paper form training and get a decal for your trailer to show you took it. Now, the legislation that went through came with no funding to do it, but the ability to subcontract it. So this is the structure that we were given by legislature, is to do it like if any of you have ever taken the DNR's Boat and Water Safety course, which is required, sorry, I walked away from my water, which is required for kids, I think, age 12 to 17, and then any adult can take it, and you can sometimes get a discount on your insurance. I'll just give you that little tidbit. But it's an online course that we contract with a vendor that does actually a lot of the boat and water safety nationally, and you pay $20 or $30 to the vendor. That's their incentive for doing it, and they manage the whole program and they give us the data on it. So there will be this new training that's required starting, well, it's required, the decals are required July 1st of 2015. We'll have an online training and paper version also available in January, so that we've got 6 months for people to get up to speed. And so that one, we've contracted a $0 contract because there's no funding, but we've done a formal contract with a business, actually a local business in Minnesota, that is planning the training, will host it, will do all the work, and they'll, right now it'll be a $5, and a 20-30 minute course. This is not gonna cause lots of behavior change and radically change things. This is the basics. This is to get a large number, all the folks that are trailering gear, to know the basics about invasives, and mostly to know and follow the laws and best practices, depending on the gear they're using. So that, and if you do a paper version, it'll be a little bit more for shipping, but so that's what we're given. If anyone's interested in learning more about that program, let me know. I'd be happy to chat after class or another time with you about that one. So there was another hand though too, I think, or something. Oh, thanks. I didn't invent it. I'm managing the program. I'm trying to launch PR for it at the fair.
Are pleasure craft, like personal water equipment, is that also included, regulated? So it's equally the same?
Watercraft includes all of them. So if it's
even if it's like a plastic flotation device?
With water-related equipment, I have drawn the line for my program for canoes and kayaks and those sorts of things. Yes, they are, but like inner tubes, we haven't pursued that. But
float tubes, fishing float tubes,
what?
streams and lakes. Or maybe I shouldn't have brought it up.
No, I'm curious.
Floaty waiter kind of thing?
Well, fishing float tubes are they're basically vinyl or urethane. Nylon covered fishing.
It would follow like your bait bucket is water related equipment.
Right.
Lots of that stuff is. So, and most of it, if you're using, like, I think of it as personal gear, like waders and things. For the most part, I try and get people to understand, don't panic about, pay attention, and there's some easy steps you can do. I'll get into that in a sec, actually. But it's usually rinsing stuff off, scrubbing it, letting it dry out between water bodies. So a lot of the time, it's not a panicky situation. It's knowing some basic best practices, that clean, drain, dry message. I'll get into more about that. Here's my crawlers one, but I still can't tell you what category they are. But there are some really great resources. If you haven't gone to the DNR's invasives page, it's actually pretty nice, especially the species part, if you're looking for information about species. Sea Grant, based out of Duluth, has phenomenal stuff too. So I would recommend those two to get a lot of good content. There are grants for like the brown signs for organizations, they're metal signs. There are postcards that Earthworm one is a postcard through our Division of Forestry that we put together. So there's lots of different resources if you're ever trying to communicate and get the word out. That's another thing in this category of what can you all do as citizens and as stewards. And that we already talked about reporting new infestations, so I won't go back into that. Let's take a break. I got a few more things of what you can do within law and fill up your brains a little bit more. So let's do 10 minutes, go to the bathroom, fill up water, fill up snacks. Did I just disappear because I sat? Okay.
No, that's the thing that we used for the
Okay. One of the things that you all can do is just to be informed. I know a couple people were just at the very beginning, and I asked, what did you observe? For those of you that looked at something this week, one of the things was that you didn't know there was invasive species law. So just becoming aware of some of this stuff and being able to find out more when you need to know more is huge. So I threw a short section on invasive species law in Minnesota into this as a subcategory of things you can do and know as a water steward. Now, a lot of this gets really dense and legal language, so I'm giving you the Cliffs Note version of it. If there's anything that you really want to get in depth with, definitely ask questions as I go through this part, but I might put it to the side and have us talk about it because not everybody always is interested, and it is some of it's just very dense stuff. Has anybody here read Minnesota statutes for anything? That's legit. Statutes, our law, Minnesota state law, it's our statutes, yeah, okay. It's not very thrilling reading. It's fascinating. It's hard to read, I find. I'm more of a fiction reader myself, but. Well, no, it might be based on fiction, but it sure. Okay, so there are a few legal terms. Whenever I start this, I already told you about how we categorize invasive species in Minnesota, the categories, but I threw around some, I said transport and introduce without really explaining a whole lot about it, but it's fairly straightforward. You can get into a little minutia, but when you can't possess, you can't even own any or possess any prohibited species. You can't transport it. You certainly can't introduce it. And when I say introduce, again, that means to intentionally or unintentionally let it escape in a free living state. So there are rules about transporting and introducing invasive species. I kind of got to those earlier when I gave you the definitions. And I shouldn't say rule, that's a law. You can't transport, you can't introduce prohibited or regulated, you can't transport or introduce prohibited species. You cannot introduce regulated species, invasive species. You can't transport any aquatic macrophytes. There's my fancy science word that's straight out of statute. Any aquatic plants, you cannot transport them from a water body. So native or not, or invasive, doesn't matter. If you've got a whole bunch of coontail, who's got the table that's got a sample of coontail? You guys do? Hold that one up. That's a really common, healthy Minnesota native plant that sometimes takes over your lake because it's so healthy and it can be annoying. But that one, you can get fined for hauling that around as much as you can get, just the same as you can get fined for hauling around Eurasian water milfoil. Because it's very hard to regulate what kind of plant is that, and it's starting to dry up or wilt, or it's going 55 miles an hour down the road. It's pretty easy to say, just don't carry aquatic plants around. Now, there of course are exceptions if you're moving aquatic plants in sealed containers from plant store. There are some exceptions, but not invasives. So don't haul plants around on your equipment. That was a lot. That's all I really needed to say. That's that one. This is the hardest one, or has been, I think, the hardest one for Minnesotans to get used to, is draining their water and pulling out their boat plug. Does anybody in here? I grew up in a family where we did have a lake place, but, well, it was my grandparents, so I wasn't in charge of the boat, and it was a cruddy old pontoon and like a little rowboat. So ballast and drain plugs and all that was news to me. But how many of you haul a boat around for fun at times? Anyone trailer a boat? Not many in this group. Oh, well, okay. I should say, how many of you haul around a motorized vehicle, like a jet ski or any kind of a motorboat? Okay, so not too many in this group. And that helps me because when I the business trainings I do, most of the time there's a huge variety of different businesses that come to my trainings. I did one in Winona where it was all river rats. All the folks that came were kayak outfitters and canoe outfitters, and they're taking this test that I'm giving them, and one finally just said, "What is ballast?" Because they don't deal with inboard or inboard-outboard motorboats. That's not what anyway. So it helps me with you all. So if you're not used to boats, they got a drain plug. If you don't keep the drain plug in and you put your boat in the water, it sinks. So it's a very important thing to remember to put back in. And traditional habit is if you ever touch your boat plug, which a lot of people never even touch the sucker, but you're supposed to inspect and do all this stuff. But if you do, you usually do it at home before you hit the road so you don't forget when you're at the access and then watch your boat go down and have to pull it out and drain it out, put the plug. It's a pain. But it's a behavioral thing. It's not hard. Now, the law says you have to pull your plug out, or there's some that have a, what's the word? Yeah, no, like a valve system in them that you don't actually have to pull because it's pressure. It's not pressurized.
Check valve.
It's a,
It
thank
only-
you.
Water flows
Only one way. Thank you. Huh. Anyway, so you either have to have something like that or you have to have it pulled. And it's taken a long time, and people are still learning this one, and they're still getting ticketed for this one because they forget or they don't care, or they, you know. And this law has been in effect since 2012, so it's been a few seasons of it now, and a lot of people know it, but that's one. The other piece that's hard is when you can't take water from lake to lake, infested or non-infested. Again, they made it simpler in law, and they just said don't haul water around. You don't need to. If, however, you use live bait, if you use minnows, you do need water to keep the bait alive if you're going to go between sites. You still have to drain it between sites, and you can't put new lake water there. What you do now, the workaround for this, the legal one, is you bring jugs of water from home. Preferably you think ahead and you let it sit out so it dechlorinates, although it depends how long you're going to have your bait sitting in it. But you have a couple jugs of water you keep in your car. When you get back, you do what this photo shows. You dump it out, back up by your car, not near the water, you pour it in. And it's pretty clear when I talk with conservation officers, it's pretty easy to tell if you brought water from home versus you scooped it out of the lake. There's a little difference in what it looks like. So again, it's kind of a pain, it's getting used to, but it is one of those things that's a pretty easy, simple, broad-based fix that just stops it. And it also stops, like, the question about invasive carp as minnows. If you, or no, it doesn't. Sorry, my brain's getting ahead of me. Because you can still have those, sorry. Let's see. This is one I find really interesting because most folks, I didn't know about this, a lot of folks don't, that there is a law that what's the consent, operating consent, what's the one for driving a car? Implied consent. It's like implied consent, but if you are going to use watercraft and trailer them and use public access, there's there's an implied consent to comply with inspections. And there are people that do refuse inspections every year, but you are legally supposed to comply with the inspection. So, all right. This is a new one that I really like letting people know because it's still only a year and a half old and it's not well known, but there is the only dry time on the books. You'll hear that clean, drain, dry message. You'll see it on billboards if you go up north, all over. And that's a great, simple message. Legally, other than this law, the DNR can't tell anybody to dry anything for any period of time. When we say clean, drain, dry, you'll hear like 5 days thrown out. There's a lot of best practices, but legally, DNR cannot make you dry your boat between sites. The one exception now, as of 2012, you do have to dry any dock or lift or that type of equipment for 21 days before you move it between different water bodies. That make sense? Well, I'll tell you about that. And it doesn't mean like if you have it on your own lake and you pull it out and you put it back in your lake, it doesn't matter. It's if you're going to sell it and move it to a different lake, it has to dry, or over winter, it just has to be out 21 days. This time frame is based on the biggest, baddest, strongest zebra mussels surviving. Zebra mussels love to live in dark, cool areas in perfect conditions. If you take them out, they'll be inside dock posts like crazy. And if you get a really big, robust one and it's maybe in the 50s and it's cool and humid, they can live days to over a week out of water. and it's very hard to get them out of tubing, as you can imagine. And so based on research that shows at least a week, different research will show different lengths depending on how thick their shells are and what the conditions are, but basically a week to 2 would be the time frame, the best time frame for most of them to the best case scenario for them to survive, or worst case, depending on how you look at it. So the 3 weeks is insurance policy. It's being very conservative. It's saying, you know what? Make sure that they're dead before they're moved. Because we've had infestations move around the state and start from this, and this is much more high-risk equipment than a watercraft, generally speaking. It depends on the scenario and the instance, but just by the nature of this type of equipment and the difficulty of clearing out tubing, this is where you're going to get, if a boat hops from lake to lake, zebra mussels can't attach in a couple hours. The risk for boats hopping from lake to lake is the water and invisible, the tiny microscopic zebra mussels. In this case, these they stay put. You could have one and have just a few inside the tubing, or a whole bunch if you don't look in there, and it easily can spread. So at any rate, docks, lift, and the legal language says, and associated equipment. So there's a little leeway there. But that style of long-term equipment is the only dry time currently required by Minnesota state law. Any questions about that one? Your brain's hurting yet? It's a lot of information. There's one exception. You're not supposed to possess zebra mussels, right, or other prohibited species. So if you happen to have a dock on Minnetonka, which this clearly is not Minnetonka, but if you had a dock covered with zebra mussels and you pulled it up on your property, they are in your possession. So when this law was first made, tons of Minnesotans were breaking the law. So there's this riparian or shoreland exception for gear, because if you're pulling your dock out of Minnetonka and you're on the shore and you put it right back in the next season, you don't have to scrape the zebra mussels off, the dead ones. Now, here's the fun part. If you have a dock on Minnetonka, but you live a few blocks off the lake, and you or a business that you hire pulls your dock in and out for you for the year, they can use that one-way pass to take a totally encrusted dock back to their place or your house for the winter. The zebra mussels will all die. They can't survive the winter, but you still will have to scrape them all off before you transport them back, because the way the law is written is about transporting. It doesn't say if they're alive or dead. You cannot transport prohibited species. So this riparian exception is fantastic. It covers most parts of the state and many instances for what I'd say average lakeshore people, that you're not breaking the law by pulling your gear up, and it's silly in an infested lake to have to clean it up when you're going to plunk it right back in. But here's one of the parts when I teach my classes with businesses. Not only are you doing a risk assessment, they as a business owner might know and have possession of that dock all season. They know none of the zebra mussels that are left on it after winter are alive, but it is still illegal. They can still get ticketed going back in the spring. So you also have to know the law, and which isn't the most intuitively fun part of describing this, but it's the structure we have, and it keeps evolving. It's getting better. It's still not perfect. For those, we mentioned penalties earlier, just like any other civil law. Primarily, the enforcement, the DNR Enforcement Division does mostly civil tickets over criminal. But you can see the penalties for the things I just rattled off. If you're transporting plants and aquatic plants, it's $100 or up to. It's like getting a speeding ticket. Not that anyone here would know about that, but it varies by county based on county fees. So it's up to. Launching with plants attached is $200. Transporting or possessing any prohibited species, that's $500. That's a pretty big civil ticket compared to a speeding ticket. So the poor guy that didn't realize and picked up that fantastic encrusted shopping cart that you can see at the state fair. We have it there every year now. He found it and thought it would be really cool and drove it across Minnesota to take back to his shop in North Dakota, and was, I think, the first or one of the very first recipients of that $500 fine for possessing zebra mussels. And I have to say, come by see me at the DNR, at the fair. It is a really cool looking thing. If you've never seen a weird object encrusted with zebra mussels, it is cool to see, I have to admit.
And hard
But-
to argue that he didn't know they were there.
Oh, yes, right. But, you know, it was the first year of the program. He was from North Dakota. He didn't know yet. And we couldn't, it was very prominent. He was sharing it. He was sharing pictures of it all over. It wasn't like we could be like, whoops, didn't see that. Anyway, so that one, and the other serious high amount one is launching into a non-infested water body with invasives attached. So you can see the priorities here. Don't possess the prohibited. Don't launch into clean waters with species unattached.
Curious.
Yeah.
When there's an oil spill, they bring out these buoys to try to contain
Mm-hmm.
and limit the damage.
Mm-hmm.
If there's someone that launches into a non-infested with AIS attached
Mhm.
to their boat, do you have like guys coming out with suits and trying to capture? Or
No, it doesn't. Yeah, no. If it's a plant fragment like Eurasian watermill foil, it just takes a couple inches of it. They're not gonna, and it can sink. It's a aquatic system. It's too messy, and it would be cost prohibitive to try and go after. No, it's not like a point source, like an obvious big old oil spill. It's gonna be lots of little stuff. No. And zebra mussels oftentimes they're primarily either spread in their young stage when you can't see them through water, so you can't go detect them and scoop them up. It just goes with the current. They can't swim upstream. That's the one nice thing, is they can only float until they get heavy enough and settle out, and then they stay put. Or if they're large enough and survive inside equipment to another water body, but no.
Where does that $500 go?
Hmm?
So where does that
A lot of it's just like any of the other civil penalties. I've been trying to figure this piece out too, because that's all new to me. I've never done enforcement side of DNR before up until the last couple years. A lot of it goes through the county system. The DNR actually gets, I learned this year that we lose money on every civil ticket that we have to track down. I don't know the details of it, but a lot of ours, it'll depend, maybe it's not everyone, but we do, not all of these are money makers.
You're saying for the ones that don't pay just on their own?
Yeah, yes, sorry, yeah. And actually, even on the ones where they do, this is one where I need more information to be more accurate. But it's been a little disheartening to me to start learning about this piece of it, because it's complex and it's multi-layer county and state government.
County issues a ticket, you have to reimburse the county, is that, and
Yeah.
that's where the loss occurs?
Yeah, it's just like with, that's our legal system, So, but we primarily, and from what I understand in talking with officers, we primarily pursue civil tickets for invasives. Sometimes they'll be criminal, but generally it's civil.
What's an example of criminal?
Criminal goes to court, and you have civil's a lot easier to prove. Criminal.
What would be an example of something that was a criminal?
Oh, any of these could be. You could do any of these as a criminal category and a civil category. Just like you can try somebody for, and then again, I'm getting out of my range because I'm not a litigator. But you can write a civil ticket for something, or you can write a criminal. You can give them a civil citation or a criminal citation.
So if the conservation officer believes that it's intentional, they've refused inspection, they're doing this knowingly, they can start them with a criminal citation.
I don't know. I think in intention you can also give a civil. This is one where I need to talk with an officer too.
Repeat offenses?
I'm sorry, what?
Repeat offenses, like if they keep doing it over and over?
Yeah, but I think you can get multiple civils as well too. This is one where I have to defer, because
You're not a lawyer.
Well, I'm not a lawyer and I'm not a conservation officer. I've been picking up a lot of this as I go, but it's fascinating. Other questions about it that I might not be able to answer? But I'm willing to give it a shot or find out. I also am good at that teacher line. I don't know, let me find out for you. Yeah, no, I go and ask people. I do like the Google, but that's why I get an inordinate number of calls from our information line down, because they're like, April will answer. All right, because it's a pet peeve of mine to get sent. If you get like somebody that's like, I've talked to 5 people, I'm like, okay, well, I'm the last one you're going to talk to, so just hold on. All right, so I know we're starting to wilt a little bit. I do want to just give you some basics for inspection and decon. Now, I know based on my quick poll that you're not a lot of boat owners, or at least not watercraft owners, but keep in mind these are base principles that apply to all equipment. So it is very simple. You inspect things, you clean them, you drain them, you dispose of what you clean off of them, and you dry them. Now and also I want you to keep in mind, this does not mean you take out towels and you get every drop of water off of something and then take it. There are certain instances where you do want to towel something dry at very specific things, but what I'm trying to say is don't panic. It makes me think of kind of Arthur Dent, wasn't that? And Carrie, yeah, Carrie, that's kind of, I'm kind of outing myself as a geek there, but it's, don't panic. Okay, so regardless of the type of equipment, you want to inspect it, you want to be methodical. So if you're out and you've got waders and you're using them for something, when you get out of the water, inspect them. Are there plants on them? Is there any sediment, any kind of muck or mud in them? Look for anything you can remove or scrub or rinse off. Pretty straightforward. That's all kinds of gear, docks, lifts, boats, everything. So you remove the stuff, a boot brush in your vehicle if you're doing a lot of field work. This is also really good advice for terrestrial invasives because a lot of seeds go through muck in the bottom of your boots. And you know, if you're going between a lake and a river, or between any water body, take a look before you go, and if you're going in the same day or don't have time to dry or clean off equipment between sites, look them up ahead of time. Are they infested? Go from like the headwaters downstream, because you'll, just by that very nature, you'll usually, it's a sneaky way to be a little cleaner as you go from site to site. You can spray them with, if you got a hose handy, it doesn't have to be some fancy decon high pressure hot water thing. The only reason we use hot water high pressure systems when you see the decon sites is because hot water is a really effective, fast, cheap way to kill zebra mussels. 10 seconds of contact time at about a foot distance kills them. It's a lot easier than trying to bleach them. People a lot of times will want to kill them with some kind of a chemical. Their muscles, they clam up. And they can survive in that for days because they're designed to survive out of water to keep everything out. And the rest of your boat guts are probably not as sturdy as they are. So the idea of pouring bleach into your watercraft to kill them off and then having to leave it there for days to be sure you got everything is just not feasible. But there's all sorts of other legal and safety reasons that it's not a great idea. Hot water kills them. The pressure just makes it easier to clean them off. That's why we use it. But if you got a hose, a garden hose, and you can rinse something off, you're lowering your risk. This is all about risk management. Yeah?
Is there a length of time that the seaweed can dry when it's in danger?
Yeah, but I don't know how long. And with Eurasian water milfoil, that one, I think once it's dry, it's done. The curlyleaf pondweed has these hardened stem tips called turions that disperse later in the season and start new infestations or new growths. Those, I don't know their longevity out of water. That one I'd want to check and see their viability, if it's more like a seed or not. But generally, if you've got them on your shoreline, we tell people to just do a pile and compost them on site. Because unlike terrestrial plants, once you pull the aquatic ones out, if you're not moving anywhere, you can just let them die there and, you know, dry up or rot up, and they'll be fine. We've already covered drain all your water. And and then dry stuff. And I mentioned before, there's that 21-day mandatory dry time. If you're moving just boats and other equipment, and you know you're going from a zebra mussel water or an infested water to a non-infested, ideally, let it sit out for 5 days. That's ideally. If you can't do that, rinse it off. Sit it in the sun as long as you can. Zebra mussels hate temperature changes, so they can die off out of water a lot faster than that 1 to 2 week window I was talking about. So, and I already talked about waders and any personal gear. You just know your water bodies that you're in regularly and look for unusual things. It's being methodical and straightforward. Most inspections for watercraft take about, what, 10 minutes?
Yeah, or even less than that.
Yeah, 5 to 10 minutes for most of them. So it's not a giant burden. Okay, that was plenty. I know I need to give Peggy some time to wrap up. So here's what I want to take my last couple minutes with you all. First of all, to let you know, I brought up a bunch of just like different handouts on some terrestrial species, some aquatic species, some partner programs and promo stuff. There's a lake monitoring program from the Pollution Control Agency that's pretty neat. So just a smattering of things. You're welcome to it. I have, I think, 8 maybe of these. A business sent us stacks of these buckthorn baggies. It's an experiment. They're patent pending. If anyone's dealing with buckthorn and wants to test it out and see it, you're welcome to grab one. You bag up the buckthorn and leave it for a year.
So it goes over the stump?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, so well, I'll let you guys duke that out on your own. You can come up. And if anyone wants more, the gal that has a box of them on her desk at my office would probably love to get rid of them. Because, you know, business sent them and was like, here, hand these out. So, yeah.
Will the DNR send out packages of that invasion, those publications?
Some, yeah, if the ones that are ours, yes, we do. There are some limits on numbers, or just call me or email me. You got my card, right? Yeah. Okay, so just call me. I'll let you know. What's it? Okay, so logistical, get that. I do have a few more cards, and also Peggy, you've got all my info to get to if they want to contact me. Yeah, that's probably easier. If you have questions, though, definitely call me. This is, I mean, I've talked your ears off for 3 hours on this, and I've barely touched the surface. There's a ton of stuff about this. There's a lot that I'm still learning, but don't be shy. If you have questions, definitely call or email. I'd be happy to get you to the right person or the right answer. And then the last 2 things. One is if you have specific questions about species, I did throw some slides in here. So if anyone wants to come up and ask me questions about some of the species, I really didn't focus on a lot of the guts of their biology, no pun intended, and some of those things. But I'm happy to chat for a few minutes about that sort of stuff. At any rate, and the last and most important thing is thank you. Thank you for tonight. Thank you for becoming Master Water Stewards. We need more of them. And for your dedication to this. You don't have to come for 3 hours every week and fill up your brains. As exciting as it is, I'm sure for many of you, or you wouldn't be doing it, it's still a lot of work, and I appreciate it, and thank you very much. I appreciate all that you're going to do. Oh.